Good morning, everybody. But it's always nice to be invited back. You know, I'm both surprised and thrilled when that happens, because it means that one of two things: either I haven't screwed up entirely, or they really want to see if I know what I'm talking about. So either case, I'm just happy to be back here again. And this, I'll be candid, this is one of my favorite groups because I get a lot of engagement from a relatively small group of people. People will write me emails after my presentations, and we'll correspond and create connections and work on projects and just basically brainstorm on our common goal of how to understand and foster student success. So I love that you all are committed to this. This will be an easy sell in terms of what I do. Sometimes I go to schools where I'm not as well received, or the content that I'm presenting is a little bit too far from the daily grind that the faculty has to focus on. They ask, what's the point? It's really the students who are lazy. So there's a lot of issues that other faculty and other institutions are struggling with that I'm happy to see we're not contending with as much here. And maybe a good sort of basis for the conversation today is to recognize that this conversation is part of a larger project here at Santa Fe, which is to create an intervention that will essentially target the psychological barriers that students contend with in those moments of ambiguity and difficulty. So basically, if I were to summarize how social psychology is applied to performance and motivation, it will be as follows. So if you want to take notes, this is a good time. But I don't encourage that you do take notes, because then you're not paying attention. But if you did want to, essentially what social psychology tries to exclaim is that our perceptions are subjective, and that from moment to moment we are meaning-making machines. And in that moment, the meaning that we make has an impact on how we see ourselves in that context, and it also has an impact on how we choose to engage or disengage from that context. Now, putting academics into context of our evolutionary sort of growth as a species, it's not natural for us to sit down and be told that we're wrong repeatedly. Like, that's just not what we're designed to do. And yet, that's what we expect of our students. In fact, evolutionary, we're designed to protect ourselves. We're designed to seek the things that nourish us, that guarantee connection and belonging, that guarantee immediate reward. And yet that's the antithesis of what we're doing here in academics. We're asking people to delay gratification. We're asking people to put themselves in the face of threat and criticism, of ambiguity about belonging, about competitiveness. So how do we do that? It's a challenge. And by no means am I here to say that it's easy. It's not. But there are things that we, in our positions of researchers and faculty and teachers, can do. And I hope that we can talk through and think about some of those strategies. What I also want to say is that this is your time. So some of you heard me speak. You don't want to hear me speak again, potentially. And if there's anything that you want to focus on, I'm happy to spend the next hour and a half just focusing on that. That being said, I know that some people are like, I don't yet know what I want to talk about. But as we get rolling, if you do have any questions, comments, thoughts, just feel free to just blurt it out. You don't need to raise your hand. Just sort of speak up whenever you feel that's relevant. Given that I have been here before, I do want to sort of do a slightly more deeper dive from the last conversation, which I just summarized in a couple of sentences earlier. So those of you who weren't here, then you've kind of gotten a brief version of that. But now what we want to do is look at one particular set of biases that we all have within the understanding of this concept of time. So, time is something that we all talk about. We have watches, we have appointments, we have Google calendars, we talk about time in the morning, evening, afternoon. And yet we take it for granted that this notion is a human-constructed construct, that we've made it up in our minds, and that outside of our minds it does not exist. We can't touch it, we can't manipulate it, we can't really interact with it in any way other than how we construe it in our minds. And so when you construe something in your mind, necessarily there will be bias. There will be skews in which that sort of pull you in one way or the other. Now the question is, how do these skews and these biases impact you and your students on a daily basis? And that's one of the things we'll talk about. In brief, one of the sort of fundamental biases that we all have as we think about time is that we tend to be myopic in many ways. As I mentioned, from an evolutionary perspective, we are designed to focus on the immediate rewards and punishments. If there's a threat coming our way, we will survive if we can run away right away. So this whole notion of extending our reactions is a relatively new phenomenon, and putting that in the context of our myopic tendencies, especially as we try to understand our students, potentially might be helpful. So I said a lot, but let me try to unpack it a little bit as we get into the presentation. I'm not going to bore you with too much detail, but just to sort of highlight again the importance of what we're talking about here. Academics and education, in my perception, continues to be the great equalizer. That above and beyond any other opportunity, on average, in this country, that getting access to a quality college education continues to be the single best avenue towards gaining a living income, essentially providing for you and your family, and having a life of meaning and significance. And yet we have these vast discrepancies in terms of the percentage of students that we want to see succeed and the ones who actually are. The majority of students, it turns out, who have this sort of rendezvous, who have this encounter with education, end up having a breakup. And that's kind of sad, because there is so much promise. There's so much anticipation about how you can change your life, the life of your parents, the life of your kids, the life of your friends. And yet, when that goes sour, what does that do to that generation of individuals? And that does tend to be the majority of individuals, which is kind of something that's important for us to recognize as we tackle this sometimes difficult issue. So as we're thinking about education and we're thinking about our sort of construals of time, I do want to just sort of highlight through some examples this tendency that we have for myopic preferences. So we all sort of know a version of this example. If I were to ask you to rate your level of desire for a box of chocolates now versus a box of chocolates later, it turns out that most people will say, you know what, I'll take the box of chocolates now. It seems a little bit more attractive because I'm hungry now. You know, I've been really good today. I've delayed a lot of things. I got up early to come to a really boring talk. I want my chocolate now. Tomorrow, I don't think I'll want it as much. Tomorrow, I think, you know, I'll get up in time. I'll have a good breakfast. I'll be able to be nourished and won't fall prey to what I'm feeling right now, which is, you know, an oddity. It's not really how I usually go about things. And sure enough, you know, when you ask people the same question, which would you rather have, the box of chocolates now or the box of chocolates in a week, but moved up by a year, so thinking a year from now versus a year and a week from now, then our sort of rational, even-minded, keeled perception of ourselves realizes that I'd rather have, and I should have mentioned, sorry, that the bigger box of chocolates and the smaller box of chocolates actually represents what you'd be willing to take. So in the short term, if I gave you a bigger box of chocolates, you actually would be more likely to say, I'll take the smaller one now as opposed to wait for a week and get the bigger one later. If I said the same question but moved up by a year, then you say, no, then I know that the bigger box of chocolates is better objectively than the smaller box of chocolates, and I won't feel then what I feel now. And so that bias for later won't apply to me right now. And so clearly, in a year from now, I'll wait that extra week to get the box of chocolates. Now, isn't that interesting? That we recognize that in the moment we have this sort of bias towards the immediate reward, but thinking long term or thinking into the future, we're blind to see that these patterns repeat. And that's part of one of the challenges, that when we're thinking about time and our own interactions with time, we tend to forget how immediate contextual factors impact our reward, our desires for reward and punishment, relative to how we think we're going to behave in the future. And that becomes one of the obstacles. Because when you ask people and ask students to set goals, like, yeah, setting goals is great. I think I should set goals. But do they? No, I'll do it later. Because right now I've got to study for this test, or right now I want to go party with my friends. And so this becomes sort of the root of one of the challenges that we have to target. Not the fact that people don't want to set goals, but that they are somehow impeded by these biases and time construals that makes them think that they'll do it later. And really, they're not to blame. Here's a heuristic that's really helped me out in my life. Whenever I have a hard time understanding people, which is not that uncommon, I've reminded of a metaphor that goes something like this. If you are told that there is a burning fire and that inside the building of this burning fire there is a man, and inside and from the room where this man is and along his path there's also another room where there happens to be a crying baby, and you're waiting outside, let's say you're the parent of this crying baby, and what you see come outside is a man but not carrying the baby. How do you feel? Turns out you might be pretty upset. You start to think, well, why didn't he come and go in and try to save the baby? Why didn't he sort of, take a moment to help another person? But that sort of judgment completely dissipates if you then learn that that person is deaf. That the person could not have perceived the crying baby, and so they did, based on their perception, the only thing that made sense, which was to get out. And I'm not saying that the analogy that our students are deaf is one that I'm trying to convey or promote, but that the fact is that people do things that they think makes the most sense based on the amount of information that they have. And the biases that we use to inform our decisions are kind of like, they're inwardly focused in terms of our own decisions, that we understand our own physical needs, we understand our own sort of mental processes, we understand our own emotions in the moment, but we don't project that as well to other people or to ourselves in the future. So recognizing this tendency, how do we interact, how do we communicate with our students to overcome this tendency of focusing and being impacted by the immediate moment as opposed to the long-term things? So as I mentioned, from an evolution perspective, our brains really are not sort of designed to think about these long-term outcomes and prospects. We are evolutionarily designed to tend to the immediate rewards, but also the immediate threats. Right? We are social creatures that rely on each other as a network to help us defend against threats in the environment, whether it be a dinosaur or an antagonistic clan. We have evolved to need to belong to each other. And so anytime there's a cue, albeit subtle, that suggests that maybe we don't belong, we become hyper-vigilant to why that cue is there and what we can do to remedy it. If I feel like I'm being ostracized, then guess what? Nothing else matters. I want to know why it is that I'm being excluded so that I can remedy that and get sort of reacquainted back into that group or sort of valued by that environment. And the truth is that grades and this evaluation system that we have essentially is a chronic sign of stress and threat. We're constantly trying to tell students whether they belong or don't based on the evaluation system that we have. And so if they perform poorly, then it turns out that they can't really focus on whether or not their long-term goals matter. They're more focused on the feelings that are a consequence of getting that response. And the challenge is that these cause ineffective trade-offs. As I mentioned, if given a larger box of chocolates a week from now versus a smaller box of chocolates, because you feel the immediate impulses and emotions that you have, you make inefficient trade-offs. So a student who feels like they might have been ostracized from a party because they didn't get the invite might sort of obsess about that as opposed to studying for the right sections. If they feel like they haven't eaten well that morning, then they can't focus in class. If they feel like there's trouble back in their family, back home, then they can't go to the library and study. All of these things are things that are constantly sort of vying for our students' attention that is really powerful, and powerful in ways that maybe we underestimate sometimes when we ask students to go through the syllabus, do the expected homeworks and deadlines and assignments, and then come back and be in optimal shape in the class so that we can have this sort of intellectual conversation. And yet we get surprised when we see them dozing off or being distracted by their phones. That's a lot more attractive, unfortunately, than most of us in this room. And my son, he reminds me of that on a daily basis. If he has 20 minutes of TV time, which is all he gets, then that's all he pays attention to. He just zones in. He doesn't look at me. He won't even respond to me. And I've tried this. Sometimes I'll say, hey, Marcus, do you want a chocolate? As he's watching TV. And he won't even hear me. But the fact is that these are very powerful stimuli that grab and activate these more primal neural connections that we have to recognize are at work for what we're trying to do. And these sort of myopic tendencies, they create tunnel vision. So if you're starving, if you're hungry, then all you can focus on and think about is food. If you're feeling like you're going to be ostracized or do poorly, then all you can think about is that potential threat of ostracism. And yet, again, in this context, we're asking students to constantly be thinking about and engaged with their long-term goals. So how do we sort of balance these tensions is one of the things that we need to think about. The other thing that's important to remember or to recognize is that in moments of ambiguity and depleted resources, defaults carry a lot of weight. When things seem confusing or you don't have the cognitive resources to think for yourself critically about is this something I want to engage with or not, the defaults play a huge role. And here's a really vivid example of that. If you think about organ donation as being a representation of something that you value as being important or not, so like obviously I would want to save someone's life if I can. And I believe most of us in this room would feel the same way. And yet when we look at the statistics from different countries, we see these vast differences in the proportion of people who agree to be organ donors or not. And it turns out it's not that the individuals in these different countries are different kinds of people or that they have less empathy, but it has everything to do with the process of defaults. So in the countries with the blue, there is, so let me just start with the countries in the gold, where you have 4.5%, for example, of Danes saying, yes, I will donate my organs, even though you'll be dead, you won't need them. How could you cruel individuals? But it turns out that that's not the reason. It's not that they haven't, they don't have the good intentions to do this. It's simply because when there are difficult and important questions, then those decisions become so taxing that you want to offset them or delay them for the future. So probably most of us do think about, is this something that I want to do? And if we're not quite sure in that moment, then we'll just say, well, I'll think about this later. That also explains why most people are not good at doing retirement savings or investing. It's just in that moment, it's something that is important to me, and so I don't want to do something unless I'm fully informed. So maybe I'll do it later when I have more time to think about it, which, as we all know, never happens. But the critical difference in terms of these countries is in the way in which people are asked about this important decision. In these countries in gold, the question is, do you choose to opt in? And you have to sign your card to say, yes, I choose to give my organs once I pass. And so in that moment of difficult and ambiguity, then you choose to say, I'll do it later, and you don't sign your card. In the blue countries, the default question is, do you choose to opt out? So the same principle applies, that it's still a complex question, it's an important decision, but I'll decide later, and in the meantime, I'll just go with the default, which is, I won't opt out. And so the context, I think, hopefully this is highlighting the importance of the context as we're interacting with these cognitively depleted individuals who populate our classrooms and even our households and sometimes our lab, our meeting rooms. That we are sort of faced with these barriers that tend to bias the immediacy of the moment as in exchange for the potential prospects of the long term. This also plays out in terms of how trust is formed. Again, I mentioned earlier that we are social creatures that need to belong. And in this context of education, we're asking students to put themselves in a situation of constant criticism. And what we know about learning in general is that by definition, learning happens when you put yourself at the frontiers of your ability. This is a phrase by Claude Steele. It's that place where you don't yet know something. That place where you may raise your hand and may be wrong. That place where you'll be uncomfortable. That is the point beyond your current ability level in which you will be able to learn something new. And for our students, we're asking them to live in that space, to constantly be uncertain about what they will say, what they will learn, what they will feel, and hope that they will be okay with it. Turns out that they can be okay with it if they have a sense of trust, if they believe that you are there as their partners in this journey of learning, as opposed to someone who's there to evaluate and criticize them. So easier said than done. How do you create a sense of trust? That is something that probably each of us have pretty good insight, and hopefully we're able to apply those insights. But it is something that students are uncertain about, especially students from underrepresented and marginalized groups. So if you're contending with what's known as stereotype threat, if you believe that you or your group is somehow negatively viewed in a particular context, then you become vigilant for signs that, even in their ambiguous nature, become confirmatory that you don't belong, that you're not smart enough, that people don't want you here. And so having that awkward conversation with a faculty member that first day of class or during their office hours, you'll be anxious. The faculty will be responsive, but not as responsive as maybe you would have hoped, or maybe your teachers in high school were. And then you take that to mean that indeed they don't think that you should be there, that you're wasting their time, that you can't take a risk and say something stupid or ask a question. And in those moments of ambiguity, these students tend to withdraw. And that tends to be the reaction that people have when they're thinking about their willingness to engage or disengage. So a really quick overview of a fundamental theoretical framework that helps us understand this is what we call the self-affirmation theory by Claude Steele. Essentially what that tells us is that we, at any point, occupy multiple identities. So you might be a teacher in your classroom, but then when you go home, you'll be a friend to one of your friends, and you'll have brothers or siblings. You might play sports, and any time that you have one of these identities, there's also a potential for threat. And in terms of how we see ourselves globally, this global sense of self-integrity is really defined by all of these identities that we make meaning from. So I know that I have all these sides to me, and that's essentially who I am holistically. But as I mentioned, that there tends to be these tendencies of myopia when threat prevails. And so if I feel like I'm not doing well academically, then that tends to loom large relative to all the other domains that I typically use to evaluate my self-worth on. And now I forget that, yes, I'm actually a pretty good person. I volunteer from time to time. I like to engage in sports. I eat well. I'll pick up plastic containers whenever I can so that we're not polluting the world. All these things that I do on a daily basis are absent from my mind when I get that D or that F grade on my test or my paper. And the only basis in which I define my self-worth is that grade. And now I see myself as a looming failure because I forget of this whole sort of more broad perspective of the self, given that threat is active. And so my global sense of self-integrity becomes compromised as well. Now, here's an interesting phrase that if you just read like this, and we'll come back to this phrase, might be a good representation of what we're talking about. So what you are to be, you are now. And so if John has a 3.4 GPA and Jane has a 1.5 GPA, and this self-affirmation theory tends to impact how they see their self-view, then John will necessarily see himself better, and Jane will see herself as not as adequate and competent. Now notice that this is a graph that's truncated. And notice that what I began talking about is that we have these myopic perspectives of time. And especially in the face of threat, that we tend to truncate, we tend to tunnel vision, and we tend to define our self-views based on the immediate moment. We'll come back to this in a second. When you feel that there is a source of threat, as I mentioned, you also want to maintain and preserve your self-view, which for most people actually ends up causing them to disengage from that domain of threat. So if I want to protect my global sense of self-integrity, I might need to distance myself from the threatened domain of academics and maybe go out and party with my friends. And maybe not go to the office hours. and maybe not put myself in a situation where I know I'll feel the same way over and over again, because I'm protecting my self-view in that moment. And that's fundamentally important for me as I try to function in this world. So what can we do? Well, there is indeed a line of research, which is something that we'll be potentially working with your students on, to reaffirm aspects of the self to help to rebalance the holistic view of the self. So if we know that you feel threatened in one domain, how can you remind someone that their self-definition is actually broader than that one threatened domain? Well, you just ask them to reflect on aspects of the selves that are unrelated to the threatened domain. So in fact, that's exactly what we do in these self-affirmation interventions. We ask people to think about values or domains that are important to them in a very unconditional way and tell us about why those values and domains are important to them. Generally, most people talk about relationships. That, I tend to have a really caring and loving family that I contribute to and I feel that I'm a part of. And that tends to remind me that, guess what? I actually am kind of a good person because I have all these different sides of me that I can draw strength from. And that getting a bad grade is not the sole basis of how I see myself. So these self-affirmation interventions do tend to have this sort of rebalancing effect of the self-view. So we're not sort of as impacted by the large threatened domain, and see in context how our self-view is impacted by all of the domains that we use to define ourselves. Remember how I said that this phrase captures the essence of what we're trying to get at? If you were to see this graph as I showed it earlier, then your self-view would be impacted and defined by your performance in that moment. But if instead the phrase read, what you are to be, you are now becoming, all of a sudden we're sort of shattering this barrier of keeping us locked into the immediate performance outcomes and recognizing that we're on a journey that fluctuates and getting us out of this myopic perspective, so that we can see beyond the immediate moment and recognize the potential for change down the line. So hopefully John can see that, and Jane can too, and they recognize that in the long term that there are these ebbs and flows, that sometimes they'll be up, sometimes they'll be down, and that when they do poorly, it isn't a critical reflection of their self-view, so that means that they don't need to defend against it by disengaging. So self-affirmation interventions have been widely used and highly effective in a number of domains, including improving performance, including persistence, improving health outcomes, and reducing stress. So again, if you see yourself as this well-balanced individual with many aspects and many strengths, then when you incur a threat, then you're not as impacted by that. And that's exactly what we find. As I mentioned, this is something that we're hoping to implement here with your students as part of our first attempt to see if a psychological intervention can help students cope with stress. And we can talk about that in the second half of the presentation, or at 9:30. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes to do that. But I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I do want to sort of see if we can lay out some strategies that you can employ in your classes really quickly before I open it up to some questions. So recognizing that we have these tendencies for myopic views of the self in our experiences, how do we leverage that to our benefit? Well, one of the things that we can do is to keep deadlines and evaluations constant but low stakes. In fact, learning sciences consistently conveys that if you can create these low stakes frequent testing paradigms, that benefits students, so that any single test is not so impactful on the final outcome that they can recognize that they can do the test, learn from it, prepare for the next one, and not have any one particular test be too much of a detriment in terms of their performance or self-view. The other way that you can sort of leverage myopia is also recognizing that in between deadlines, what do students do? They tend not to study as much as they should, right? They kind of wait for those deadlines, and as we all do. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I don't wait for my dentist to call me before I go and see them. It's just how it is. We rely on deadlines and reminders to recognize that something is due and something requires our immediate attention. There's a whole bunch of names for this phenomenon, but it's essentially how we function. And that's why we thrive and do well with the use of Google Calendars and calendars. That's why syllabi exist, right? So that you can tell students that there is an upcoming deadline. But how can we maybe take advantage of that and heighten that sense of urgency? One of the things that I do, and part of a larger program that we're involved with, is recognizing what are the sort of non-cognitive components that students can interact with and learn from that will enhance their learning. And essentially we're calling these adaptive mindsets. And one of which is to do two things, is to highlight the incredibly valuable opportunity that students have in being able to access education. Because it is a competitive nature that students are vying for limited numbers of opportunities in terms of the workplace, and that this opportunity has an expiration date. For some reason, students don't realize that they think they can spend the rest of their lives in college and it'll be great. But like milk, if you let it sit for too long, then it expires. This opportunity that students have to be able to make the most of their lives within the 2, 4, 6 years that they have is still time constrained. And you want to be able to frame this in a way that isn't threatening, that isn't saying that the next test will be a reflection of the rest of your life. But you also want to highlight that in terms of where you want to go, you have a short period of time to be able to activate and engage with the opportunities that are here. We do tend to see this tendency of people under-registering for courses when they first register for college, and then trying to catch up towards the end when they realize what all the requirements are. How can we shift that so that people have a more balanced engagement? Goals are great. If you can communicate them effectively, what they do is they link the long-term desired outcomes with the day-to-day decisions. There's a lot of conversation around self-control and self-regulation and how temptation tends to rob people from the ability to focus on the task at hand. Well, it turns out that any moment of temptation comes down to a decision of, is what I'm about to engage in worth what I'm about to give up? And if what you're about to give up is clear and salient, that it's not just an afternoon or an evening of potential studying time, that this is exactly what you need to do to make due progress towards your next assignment, towards your course completion, towards your college graduation, that every single moment is indeed valuable, and that when you delay that or compromise that you're actually offsetting your long-term goals as well. So creating long-term goals that are manifested in the day-to-day is key. And as I mentioned, we all know that goal setting works, but students don't do it. But if they did, then what it would essentially do is get them to realize that any potential moment that they're willing to sacrifice their immediate rewards for is in the service of their long-term goals. And I think that's one of the things that's important. And the reason why it's important is, again, this myopia. We tend to lose sight of what we're working towards. We tend to lose sight of what the long term is. So the reason why goals work is that they keep that a little bit more top of mind on a day-to-day basis. And then, as I mentioned, in terms of the context conveying a particular impact, is if we can create contexts of trust and creating defaults for our students, then we can have the kind of impact that we might want. For my own situation, I derive a lot of insight from having children, both good and bad experiences, help me learn why it is that people act the way that they do. And my only time to get work done happens to be in the mornings before the kids wake up. So I'll get up early and I'll try to squeeze in 2 or 3 hours of work before the kids wake up. Works great, and I love that time. I really try to protect that time as much as I can. And up until recently, I've been trying to work right up until the moment when they wake up. And I've sort of accepted that as they wake up, it's just going to be a bad thing. Because they're going to wake up, they're going to have demands, they're going to be hungry, they're going to be grumpy, they're going to want daddy time. I'm trying to cook them breakfast and get them dressed and get the bags ready. All this is happening because I essentially failed to create the context that will allow them to more easily integrate into their next transition. So had I taken 10 minutes to prepare their breakfast and pack their bags, then that would allow me to stay engaged with them when they do wake up, have a better experience, and in effect, actually get out the door more efficiently and more quickly. For our students, what are the things that we can do to create the defaults and create a context of trust that allows them to put themselves out there, to put themselves in the frontiers of their ability to raise their hands with questions they may not be sure about. These are the questions that I'm not sure I have all the answers to. I believe you probably all have better insight into this than I do. My challenge to you is to think about those and then employ them. Don't wait for your next class before you start to think about what you need to do for your next class. Maybe try to preempt what your students need and understand from their perspective that they're coming from a place of vulnerability, they're coming from a place where they're being asked to take a risk, and you create the context that allows them to take a risk to basically establish trust. And so what does that look like? Well, it's not going to be easy. Unfortunately, there's no easy answers in the work that we do, but it is worth it. If you're able to, for instance, on the first day of class, stand by the door and greet your students. Hi, welcome, nice to meet you. If on that first day of class, instead of spending 15 minutes going over the syllabus, you get students to introduce themselves. If on that first day of class, you tell your students about your own journey and what the ebbs and flows that you've encountered, allowing them to see you as a human and not to feel like you're simply there in a position to give them grades, which means that when they are struggling, that they feel like they can come to your office hours. Maybe having the time to send them a personalized email throughout the course and say, hey, Jane, I noticed you had a really interesting thought in the last assignment. I'd love to talk about it and hear your thoughts on that. Getting them to feel like they are seen and heard so that they recognize that you value them. How about getting to know their names? And I know these are all taxing little things, but what they do is they create a context of trust where students can feel like, okay, I can take a risk here, and that person standing at the top of the class wants me to do well. Again, not easy, they take time, but if you create the context in which your students can thrive, and I believe you all have an understanding of what those things can be, then I guarantee you that it's worth it. You may go to bed a bit more tired, but you'll rest better knowing that you've had the impact that you want to have on the students that you're working with. And at the end of the day, you know, I do what I do not because of the money, because the money's not great. The traveling is hard, but I do it because I believe in the value of the impact that we have for our students. These students who are failing out at 70% at times are looking to us to be the channels through which they either have access to education and a better life or not. We tend to be the gatekeepers that gives them the sense of whether or not they belong here or whether or not they can do it. And if we lose sight of that, then maybe we fall into the routine of our own daily lives of trying to meet deadlines, of trying to get to meetings, of doing professional development, and not recognize that if we take 10 minutes to be mindful of where they're coming from and create the context, that they will benefit and in turn we will as well. So let me stop there. I do want to be mindful of maybe having this be a conversation about you all, so that this is a good time for a Q&A in the rest of the time that we have, 10 minutes or so. So yeah, let's open it up.